This is the grave marker of William Henry Emptage, and he's actually buried at an angle, like this. So he's not lined up perfectly with everyone else. There's a reason for that. Let's tell his tale. William Henry Emptage was born in 1830 in Kent, England. His father and his uncles were prolific sailors with the East India Company. But when William was born, his father had ambitions for his son. His son will graduate from grammar school and be accepted to a prestigious university, take on a good white-collar job, be a lawyer, doctor, what have you. William graduates from grammar school at the age of 15. Being a young teenage boy, you're a rebel. He goes against his father's wishes, and he too joins on with the East India Company. For the next 5 years, he journeys on sailing ships from Britain around Africa to India and China and back. Does a decent job for 5 years, but then at the age of 20, he gets bored. His ego got the best of him. All the other Emptage men had already done this journey. He wanted to go where no other family member had been before. So he quit his job with the East India Company and he signed on instead with the Hudson's Bay. Went to the Hudson's Bay officers in London, told them, I am an Emptage. You must know my family name and reputation. Give me a challenge. Send me as far from here as you possibly can. The officer sized him up and said, absolutely, William. We're going to send you to a place called Fort Victoria. It's on Vancouver's Island. He gets on a steamboat, or not a steamboat, sailing ship. 6 months later, after crossing the Atlantic, going around South America and up the west coast, he arrives to report for work at Fort Victoria. The year is 1851. To his dismay, Victoria is more British than Britain herself. There's no challenge there. The island's already a colony. So he goes to the managers of Fort Victoria and says, I am an Emptage. Give me a challenge. They size him up and they said, absolutely. Up north, there's a chain of islands called the Queen Charlottes. Today we call it the Haida Gwaii. We believe there's gold on those islands. Last week, William, we sent an expedition. Would you like to join them? He signs up, gets on that steamboat. Steamboat takes 6 days to get from Victoria to the Queen Charlottes. First day on the job, William notices all the tasks are signed for, save for one. Igniter. Does everyone know what that entails? You're looking for gold on islands of solid rock. You're not panning for it like you would in a river. This expedition team has chisels, sledgehammers, pickaxes, and they're pretty much manually drilling holes into the rock islands. The job of the igniter, crawl into that hole. But don't forget your half keg of black powder. When you get to the end of that hole, you pack it down tight with some river clay. You're going to unroll some wick, light the wick, crawl out backwards, stand up and run for cover. William does a great job for a couple of weeks. Then one day, unfortunately, William wasn't really paying attention to the task at hand, and he unfortunately lit the wick short. Now, grammar school education is all he claimed that he needed. So he knew, logically, that he didn't have enough time to crawl out of this hole. He has to come up with some way to save himself. So William, 21-year-old William, decides, if I use my left hand to block the explosion, the rest of me should be okay. Now the rest of his team is 100 yards away. They're behind boulders, they're behind stumps. They know the basic routine. They're going to see William crawl backwards out of this hole, stand up, start running towards him. Then there should be a massive explosion in the background. To their shock, all they see is the explosion. A couple of brave men start running towards that explosion site, hoping they can salvage whatever's left of William. But by the time the dust settles, they're surprised to see William standing there, breathing. Most of the clothes on his body had been blown or burnt off. He's covered in cuts and burns, and then a fine layer of soot on top of that. But his plan worked. his left hand took the brunt of the explosion, and it was actually snapped off his arm just an inch below the wrist. But it didn't go anywhere because the skin on the back of the hand was still attached to the arm. So it's dangling there, and he's in an obvious state of shock. Now, his co-workers aren't medical professionals. But considering his hand is still technically attached to the arm, it can be saved. So they say, don't worry, William, we'll get you to the doctor in no time. They grab his hand, put it on the stump of his arm, and bandage it tightly. They rush him to the doctor. Where's the doctor? Victoria. How long was the ambulance trip? 4 days. It's an emergency, people. The rest of this story comes from the doctor's own journal. Middle of the night, the doctor hears a hammering on his front door. He jumps out of bed, rushes downstairs, and opens the front door to his home. 3 men standing in front of him. William in the center, barely awake. 2 men propping him up. 1 man holds William's arm, heavily bandaged in front of the doctor, and simply says, "Excuse me, doctor, we had a mishap 4 days ago. Can this be remedied?" And as he was explaining to the doctor what exactly happened, the doctor stated he could already smell the rot. But he wanted to see it. So right at his doorstep, he ordered the 2 men to undo the bandaging on William's arm. And at this point, the bandaging they would have used was heavy fabric and a lot of cotton. In 4 days' time, that cotton absorbs right into the skin. So as they were undoing it, they're taking off layers of skin. And then the doctor's hypothesis was correct. The infection we all know as gangrene had already set in. The hand was too rotten to save, but what worried the doctor most was that this infection was working its way halfway up William's forearm. He said, "Bring him inside. There's no moment to waste. We must amputate before this infection infects his bloodstream. It could kill him instantly." Great background music. So they rush him into the dining room and they lay William down on the table. Doctor runs about his home, trying to gather up whatever he needs for an amputation. And that's when the doctor realized that in his home, he had no chloroform. There was nothing to put poor William out. So the doctor's forced to improvise. Runs about his house, goes outside, comes back inside, finally gathers what he thinks he needs, and walks into the dining room. Doctor walks into the dining room having gathered what he thought he needs. Goes up to William and simply says, "William, I regret to inform you I have no chloroform, yet we must amputate. You will be awake this procedure. Here's a bottle of whiskey. Drink half." William drinks half the bottle. Doctor then says, "I went out back and I found this smooth stone, William. I'm going to place it in your mouth. Bite down hard." William bites down hard. 1 man holds William by the knees, another holds William by the shoulders. The doctor gets William's infected arm and holds it over the edge of the dining room table. Then he brings out his saw, because that's a medical tool, and proceeds to cut William's hand off his arm about an inch ahead of where he believed the infection had spread to. Imagine the smell. Imagine the sound. Imagine the fact that William was awake the whole time. Hand comes off the arm. Nice clean cut. Next thing the doctor wrote in his journal, "I had not done an amputation in quite some time. I realized I had made a mistake." And that's when the doctor realized he forgot to leave extra skin to fold over the wound to stitch the wound shut. So he looks at William and said, "William, finish the bottle." William drinks what he can, but he can't finish that bottle. He bites down hard on the stone a second time. One man holds him by the knees, another one holds him by the shoulders. Doctor gets a dining room chair, turns its back against the end of the table, and ties what's left of a stump of an arm of William right against the back of that chair, because the doctor needs both hands free. One to hold the saw, the second to push down 2 inches of flesh and muscle to reveal an inch of bone. And he hacks away at the bone with such velocity that the teeth on my blade began to dull. It's one of my favorite quotes from the 1800s. That inch of bone comes off clean. Have to do it fast because this guy is in agony. Folds the skin over, stitches the wound shut. Whatever whiskey was left in the bottle was poured on top of the stump to disinfect the wound. Bandage it up tightly. William was awake the whole time. Month goes by and William Henry Emptage is down and out on his luck in Victoria. No one wants to hire a man who's missing a hand. Word travels fast with the Hudson's Bay Company because James Yale hears of Emptage's plight and says, bring him on over to Fort Langley. He can work on my dairy operation. At least he can carry a milk pail in the crook of his arm. Considering he is missing a hand, the Hudson's Bay Company shall only be obligated to pay him half wages. It's the only job offered to William, so of course he obliges and comes on over to work at Fort Langley. Just like all the other men in the fort, he marries into the tribes. His wife was named Louisa. She was the daughter of a Musqueam chief. They found out they had quite a bit in common. They were born in the same year. They were both fans of Shakespeare, and I like to think it was an instant love story. They grew old together. They had 3 sons. Unfortunately, though, at the age of 62, Louisa fell ill. And on her deathbed, her husband made her the promise that if she were to die before him, he would buy her a plot in the front row of this cemetery. That's exactly what he did. Whatever money he had left, he ordered a grave marker custom made for his wife. 16 years after that, William passes away. Had quite a bit of land to his name, not that much money. So his sons and his friends pooled together to buy this family plot back here because they could not afford the expensive one in the front row next to his wife. But they specifically got this obelisk so they could bury him at this angle. If he can't be with her side by side, at least he can still see her. From the 1980s up until this year, who knows what's going to happen next year, but from the 1980s to present day, on cold, foggy mornings, people that come here to visit their loved ones buried in this area of the cemetery swear that they've seen a man appear from behind those yew trees. He has a nice 3-piece wool suit on. He has an Abe Lincoln type beard, so big beard, no mustache. His hands behind his back, and he's just taking a leisurely stroll through the cemetery. Whoever he sees in the cemetery, he just smiles and nods. But if you acknowledge him with a good morning or a hello, he'll actually stop. And he'll walk right up to you. And in a strong British accent, he simply says, "Excuse me, I'm looking for an Indian woman. Have you seen her by chance?" People say no. He just smiles and carries on with his stroll. From the 1980s until present day, people in the front 4 rows of the cemetery swear that they see an older First Nations woman wearing one of the historic costumes from the National Historic Site, frantically pacing about in the front 2 rows of this cemetery. For over 30 years, the people in town brushed it off, thinking it was a guide from the historic site who lost one of her tour guests on a cemetery walk. The only cemetery tours our historic site has ever done are in the middle of the nights in the last half of October for these grave tales. And these have only been going on for 10 years. Apparently William and Louisa are still trying to find each other.